So first I want to welcome people to this dialogue, this conversation that Angelina and I are going to have about motivational interviewing. We both are parts of a group called Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. We've invested a lot of time and effort in understanding motivational interviewing. So I'd like to start with just this idea of an introduction. Like, if you don't know what it is, and you were sitting with somebody, well, what would it look like, this thing called motivational interviewing?
So I think the first thing that comes to my mind is Bill Miller and describing it as a way of being with people. And so really taking away, you know, when you're looking at a session or a structured visit with a client or a patient, kind of removing that and really focusing on a way of being with people and a way of having a conversation with people, bringing compassion into that conversation, and really being able to listen and be present with them. You know, sometimes when I'm talking about it, I talk about, you know, the clinician bells that might go off and then the human bells. And when we're having those conversations, kind of recentering and having a conversation with a person, you know, not about a specific confine, but just being with a person.
So you're thinking about this idea of being with people and being with them in a sort of both science and art of a conversation. And you're trying to mix the two and think about what is listening well? What is being present for another person? What is hearing them and having a felt sense of them? And so you're trying to, when you think of fundamentals of describing motivational interviewing, you think about those kinds of things. What more is it to it?
Well, you know, I think of things that you have said before, and it's really honing in what is it that people are really saying, because there's a lot of noise that comes into the conversations. And so what are you really listening for? What are they really trying to tell you? And getting to the heart of what's driving whatever that situation is for them at that time. And so, you know, one of the things that you say that resonates with me is, where do people dream to go? Because we usually hear meet people where they're at. And the intention is very good with that, because what you're saying is don't jump ahead, don't move too quickly. But where they're at isn't necessarily the best place, but where is it that they're wanting to go? And so when you're thinking about being with someone and listening and being present, it's really being able to zero in on what are their values and what's important to them, and how are you having that conversation to help them sort through that.
So you've said a couple of really wonderful pieces, which is this idea of listening for the values, listening for what their hopes and dreams are. And when you're with people, that's the motivation, it really, isn't it? It's not just a conversation that we would have. It's a conversation in which we have a purpose in mind. And that purpose is to try to tap almost into values and dreams and wishes. And I love that, you know, that when you're sitting with people and they're really struggling and they really believe that they don't matter, I mean, how do you find hopes and dreams?
And I think that's where honing in on whatever is there. So if there's pain there, being able to acknowledge that. If there's joy there, if they're being able to acknowledge that. If there's trepidation, being able to sit with that. And so, because all of those factors are going to affect their path towards those hopes and dreams. So being able to identify what are those what are those emotions and feelings and the values, like you were saying, what's important to them. I think the other thing that resonates with me is, especially in that clinician realm, you get into that clinician kind of focus. When we talk about, and I know we'll go, talking about change talk, but that it's not necessarily zeroing in just on behaviors that is change talk, but what is important to them and the values. So, one of the support groups we did, we were doing that practice, and you said you had a client and they said, I want loyalty. But as a clinician, I think we're so focused on the behaviors that we're trying to help them work through, whether it's blood sugars, whether it's nutrition that we'll talk about, but what is important for them to feel fulfilled as a human being, and recognizing that that is also important as we're having a conversation around motivational interviewing.
As you started, you felt this like honing in on the pain, honing in on what's their story, what's their narrative, how do they see the world, and really be present with that. And as a helper, as a coach, as somebody that's trying to motivate people, you're thinking a lot about, again, those values. Like, even in the pain, there's a value. Even in the history of their narration of their story, there is values. Because what they choose, literally what they choose to talk about is values, is things that are important to them. And you're trying to hear with this optimism of, I understand that you're doing the best that you can with the resources you have. And that there's no judgment about it. And so it would seem as though, at least in the introduction of this concept of motivational interviewing, that what we're trying to do is to really step away from judgment and see people as being the best that they can with the resources they have. And that's the way, I loved how you said way of being earlier. It's like, it has a certain attitude, if you will, a certain sort of sense. And the next section that we talk about will be this issue of what are those attitudes that the helper needs to have, the coach needs to have, the person that is trying to motivate another person. Well, it could be a parent, for that matter, trying to motivate their child. But I do love this idea of having a conversation, a respectful conversation with another human being with motivation in mind. Like what's important to them.
Could I share a story that I feel like would fit in?
I'd love your stories.
So, I was working with a little girl. She was, I think she was 10 or 11, and it was a nutrition project. And we had goal sheets, so we were working on, they were going to be picking out what was important to them and what they wanted to work on. And so there were long-term goals and short-term goals. And this goes to the values piece. And so her long-term goal was that she wanted to sing a solo in show chorus. That was her goal. But this kid was with it, and she looked at me and she said, well, it's not really nutrition related. And I said, but these are your goals. So let's talk about that. And so we landed that that was her long-term goal. Short-term goal, one, she wanted to make fruit relish with her grandmother. But the other short-term goal was she wanted to be able to spend the night at her friend's house. Her mom she was in her second bout of breast cancer. So she was suffering from separation anxiety. And so she would try to go over, but then couldn't. And so that was what she wanted to work on. And so we did. We zeroed in on those. And 6 months after she finished the program, her mom sent me a video of her singing in show chorus. And I get choked up talking about it every time. She videotaped it and sent it to me. A year after, she messaged me and told me that she went to overnight camp at Maine for music. And so while it wasn't nutrition related, that was important to her. And that was what she valued, and she wanted to work towards that. And so I think what MI helps, selfishly it helps me do, is be able to recognize what is important and be able to step away from what my agenda might be and listen to what their agenda is. And I actually just got a message from Mom, and this is almost 15 years out. She's going to be graduating as a social worker. So, you know, I think that that giving that space for people to really recognize and share and focus on what is important to them, and how do we walk with them. You use that term a lot, but how do we walk with them on their journey and step away from what we think is right or what they should do in that clinical lens or that focus.
That lens, period, that focus.
Yeah.
Which is another part of the kind of idea here, is that what's the focus? And I love what you said in the story, and that is that, you know, as you sit with this young woman, this young girl, you know, you sort of say, what do you want to do? And you can find yourself moving the focus, because it was a nutritional conversation.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're talking about her singing, her being available to stay overnight because she was afraid of her mom dying while she was gone, and all of that, you know, just kind of feeling that. And so we, you know, as we kind of finish up the introduction, you know, I really hold on to the definition in my mind that we change people through the heart, then through the mind. And so when we walk into things like nutrition, or we tend to do the mind. We tend to give people lots of information. And that what motivational interviewing can do is to deal with that connection, which is that we change people through the heart, which is connecting with them, and then offering things for the mind. And that it looks like that connection is what's going to make them more motivated. So when you're sitting with this girl about singing and so on and so forth, you're saying to her, I believe in you. And there's something that moves her, that 15 years later, she's wanting to do some of what you were doing with her. So we change people through the heart, then through the mind, which is our connection skills. And we're going to sort of move into the fundamentals of motivation. And I hope that this gave people a decent idea, at least, of an introduction.